You know, in Texas, we have a saying that if you don't like the weather, just wait a minute, it'll change. I didn't like the weather forecast I heard Friday night. Said all our rain chances were gone. And Kenneth Rumpke, you don't have to listen since you didn't get any rain. But it was pretty pleasant when I woke up Saturday morning and there was a little thunder rumbling around. It got a nice little rain shower. But I found out Texas isn't the only place that can make that statement that just wait a minute and the weather will change if you don't like it. In our gospel lesson today, which is going to serve as the text for the message, I found another place where that weather will change just as quickly, and that's the Sea of Galilee. And the Sea of Galilee is kind of an interesting little place. It's about 5 miles wide, 10 miles long, and it sits about 600 feet below sea level. On one side, it's got some really high mountains that rise up, and on the other side, there's a number of deep canyons or gorges that come into the sea. So that wind can kind of whip through those deep canyons and whip up that warm air above the water. The cool air comes down those mountain slopes, and they can just have instant thunderstorms on the Sea of Galilee. And that's the setting for the incident that marked the cards for us today. Jesus' ministry on this earth was approximately 3 years long, and this particular incident occurred probably at the end of the second year of Christ's ministry. And it also occurred about 6 or 8 months after Jesus had selected his chosen 12 disciples. So for a period of some 6 to 8 months, these 12 men have been traveling with Jesus. They've been listening to his teachings. They've been watching him heal people. But who did they think he really was? What did they really understand about him? Well, we're going to find out that through this storm, we saw their faith be tested, and we saw them also have a chance to grow in their faith. So as we look at this text this morning, we're going to kind of look at it from what did it mean to those disciples as it happened at that time, and what does it mean to us today. If Jesus has been teaching all day long, and he's probably been sitting in the back of the boat as he's teaching. In fact, it starts off in the Gospel by saying Jesus made the suggestion, let's go to the other side, and they took him just as he was, meaning that Jesus probably never got out of the boat. Probably this little boat was up against the shoreline, and the people were lining the banks, and Jesus spoke to them from the back of the boat. When they got ready to go, the disciples simply came out, pushed the boat away from shore, and took off. One of these little Galilean fishing boats, they've unearthed several of these things. The archaeologists have studied them, and they're about the size of a big pickup truck. They're about 25 feet long. They're about as wide as a pickup truck, about 7.5 or 8 feet wide. And they're also about as tall. They're about 5 feet tall. Well, when you put that boat down in the water, there's probably about 30 foot of that boat that sticks up above the water. Well, these little thunderstorms that hit the Sea of Galilee can generate waves that are 6 foot tall. Well, this is a dangerous situation. We've got a boat that's only 3 foot above the water, and we've got 6 foot tall waves. And it wouldn't take much to sink one of those little boats. Well, that's what happens. The storm comes up. It's in danger of sinking, and Jesus is in a deep sleep. Question we ask is, how could Jesus be sleeping through the storm? It says that the waves are filling up the boat with water, and yet Jesus is sleeping. We'll talk about that a little bit in Bible class this morning, and probably the explanation that I like best is that Jesus is the creator of nature. He's in control of nature. And Jesus knew that his earthly life was not going to be taken from him until he was ready to lay it down. Jesus could sleep soundly through this storm. The disciples, on the other hand, couldn't rest. In fact, they're probably doing all they can to keep this boat from sinking. And think about it now. Several of these disciples are experienced fishermen. They've sailed across this Sea of Galilee a number of times. They're used to these little storms. They know how to handle a boat in a storm. And we have to assume they did all they could. They were doing everything that they knew how to do as good sailors, and yet this boat's going under anyway. And finally, they turn to Jesus, and they wake him up. And when they woke him up, things get a little bit interesting. If you look at Matthew, Luke, and Mark, this particular story has been recorded in those 3 Gospels, and it's a little bit different in each one. In Matthew's Gospel, Matthew says, Lord, save us. In Luke, He wrote an eyewitness account from one of the other disciples, we don't know which one, but Luke says, Master, Master, we're going to drown. And Mark's account is probably the words of Peter. Probably the Gospel of Mark was written as Peter dictated it to Mark. And possibly Peter is the one that said, Teacher, don't you care? We're going to drown. And the Gospel of Luke and Matthew, they're just simply a plea, while in the Gospel of Peter, there's a little bit of a rebuke there. In Matthew and Luke, those disciples were saying, Lord, save us. You know, in the middle of a storm, not everybody's saying the same thing. In Matthew's account, he could easily be saying, Lord, save us. The disciple that spoke to Luke may have been saying, Master, Master. And Peter may have been saying, Teacher, we're going to drown. Don't you care? Anyway, the situation is kind of desperate, and Jesus does wake up. When he wakes up, I wonder what they really expected him to do. Did they need somebody else to help them row the boat or take the water out of the boat? Is that what they wanted him to do? Or have they seen enough of his teaching? Have they seen enough of his healing to think he is kind of a special guy? Maybe he can do something? But did they really expect what they got? Because what they got was just a complete and sudden making the storm go away. And Jesus simply stood up, he spoke to the waves and to the wind, he told them to be quiet and to be still, and the storm stops immediately. Now that's impressive to me that the storm stopped immediately. When you think about a sea and all that water that's in motion, just because you stop the wind from blowing across it, the water is not necessarily going to stop. It's going to take a while for those waves to die down. And yet, it stopped immediately. Jesus has just demonstrated total control over nature, over both the water and the wind. After Jesus has calmed the storm down is the time when he decides now to rebuke the disciples a little bit. And he says to them, do you still have no faith? Or in the Gospel of Matthew, I really like this phrase, he says, oh, ye of little faith. Now, see, I heard that phrase quite a bit a couple of months ago when we were working underneath this church. When we were trying to get those jacks in place, get those beams up, and we'd reach a point where it looked like one person couldn't do it by himself. And usually we'd give the job to Jerry. And Jerry would get that jack set or get that beam up, and then he'd say, oh, ye of little faith. He'd kind of chide the rest of us and rebuked us for not having faith in what he could do. But I don't think Jesus was being very humorous with the disciples when he said, oh, ye of little faith. I think he was being very serious with them, getting them to assess why they had acted the way they had acted, why they had doubted, why they had been afraid. Now, once the storm is over with, there's really an interesting statement in the text. Now it says the disciples are terrified. Why are they terrified at this point? The storm's over with. The danger's gone. The sea is calm, and they're still terrified. This is where it gets interesting to know a little bit about how the ancient people thought and what they had just seen happen in their minds. You see, the ancient people thought that the sea was the place where all the forces of evil resided, that the sea was the center of chaos and torment, and the ancients thought that storms were caused by the evil forces. When we think of our Genesis story in creation, God's Spirit hovered over the waters of the deep. And part of what God did at creation was to make order out of the sea. He created the land. In the passage that Jim read us from Job, our Old Testament lesson, this is God's reply to Job. God asked Job, who shut up the sea behind doors when it burst forth from the womb? When I fixed limits for it, when I set its doors and bars in place, and when I said, this far you may come, and no farther, here is where your proud waves halt. And then there's a little passage in Psalms, and we sing a liturgy here in church every morning where we praise God. I wonder if this wouldn't have been some type of liturgy that the people of the ancient world would have said. And to kind of paraphrase out of Psalms chapter 89 and chapter 93 from the King James Version, thou rulest the raging of the sea, when the waves thereof arise, thou stillest them. The Lord on high is mightier than the noise of many waters, yea, than the mighty waves of the sea. In the mind of people at that time, The sea is where all the forces of evil reside. And Jesus had just spoken to the sea, and it had obeyed him. Jesus had just demonstrated control, not just of nature, but of all the evil forces. Jesus had spoken the Greek word, and I'm probably going to mess up the pronunciation of it. Epidemessis is how I would call it. But that's the exact Greek word that Jesus spoke when he spoke to the waves and when he spoke to the wind. A couple of chapters earlier in Mark, Jesus had performed the healing of a man who had an evil spirit. And Jesus had used that same Greek word, epidemessis, when he spoke to the evil spirit. The evil spirit that was within that man said, I know who you are, Jesus of Nazareth. You're the Holy One of God. The disciples had just heard Jesus speak that same word to the wind and to the waves. And their thought was, this is the Holy One of God. That's why they were terrified. They had come to a realization that Jesus was more than just a teacher. He was really God's Son. They were terrified at that time. When we look at this text today, there's kind of 3 points of it I kind of like to look at. I like to look at how the disciples reacted when a storm hit. I like to look at what Jesus' response was, and then I like to look at the final impact that this incident had on the disciples. And looking at it from our point of view, from our time, the storm at sea probably represents a lot of the storms that you and I go through. In fact, isn't life just one big storm for us sometimes? And how do we react when the storms hit us? And I'm sure as you sit here, you can think of storms that you've gone through or are going through at the present time. We have situations. In the middle of the night, you get a phone call. One of your loved ones has been in an automobile accident and been taken to a certain hospital, and you need to go to that hospital. That's a pretty scary time. Or perhaps you get called into the doctor's office and you're told the diagnosis this time is cancer, and there's not really very much can be done about it. Or perhaps you've been laid off from your job and been called in and told that they're downsizing and restructuring and your job's no longer needed, and now your job security's gone. Or perhaps in our family relationships, those seem to be the things that hurt us the most sometimes when there's difficulty between a husband and a wife, or between parents and children. Those are the kind of storms that you and I deal with in life every day. Some of the storms are kind of small, but some of them are big storms that just really tear us up, and we just really have trouble getting through some of those big storms. And just because we're Christians, we're not immune from being in a storm. I overheard 2 women talking the other day, and I knew this one woman was really having a lot of trouble. Her kids were being very disobedient. They were having financial problems. And she said to the other one, said, I've got to start going to church. There's just so much bad stuff happening in my life, I've got to stop it. And as I heard that statement, I thought, well, I'm glad you're going to go to church, but your bad stuff isn't going to stop happening just because you go to church. But then I was really glad when the next statement she said, I've got to go somewhere to get some counseling. I've got to go somewhere to get some help. And I thought, okay, now you're on the right track. But just because we're a Christian, we're not immune from storms. When this storm occurred, the disciples did everything they could to handle the situation. They did their best to row that boat or sail it or whatever, and it wasn't good enough. They were about to drown. What about us when we get in our storm? How often do we do everything we can? Think of everything that we can do before the storm is just out of control, we're not getting anywhere, and then we really get serious about praying to God to help us out. And what about the remark that Peter but the remark that Peter said when he said, God, don't you care? Have we been there? Have we been to the point where we said, God, don't you care? I mean, look at this drought, God. Pastures are burning up. Our tanks are going dry. The fish are dying in the tanks. Don't you care, God? What storms have you been in where it just keeps going on and nothing seems to be getting any better? You've asked the question, God, don't you care? That storm tested the disciples' faith, and our storms test our faith too. We might tend to say that the disciples failed their test, but you know what? They didn't get condemned for it. They got their youth. And when we go through our storms, and the storm finally lets up, and we finally come to the realization that we really didn't do very well, that we failed, God doesn't condemn us either. He may rebuke us, but He doesn't condemn us. The final impact of the storm that I saw, that the disciples had a chance to grow in their faith. They saw Jesus now as being God, not just a picture. In our storms, I think we can also grow. We can accept the rebuke when it's there, but we should also accept the forgiveness too. In our modern world, we look at this storm and we might tend to think that Jesus was just a controller of nature. We might not understand this deeper meaning that Jesus has to control evil forces. And you know, I like the disciples' interpretation. I like the disciples' meaning. I like the way that it affected them, that they were now standing in the presence of one who could control the evil forces in the world around them. Because I think that's what I would like to have in my life too, is a God that can do that. I think it's a great comfort to us that Christ can control the evil forces that stir up the storms in our lives, storms that are so bad that they can destroy our faith. There's a passage that Peter also wrote when Peter said, "Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking for someone to devour." But Christ has demonstrated that He has control over the evil forces of the world, that He's got control over Satan, and that when Satan's working against us through these storms in our lives and trying to take our faith away from us, what a comfort it is to know that Christ has the power to overcome them. You know, sometimes we look all calm and cool and collected, and yet inwardly we have great storms that are just swirling around us and we can't seem to find any peace. But knowing that Christ has the power to still that storm that's within us may help us as we go through the storm that's on the outside of us. A little story I will tell you. One time I heard a Lutheran minister, and he was talking to a number of parents about discipline problems with children. And he gave his own testimony that they had adopted a young baby that was now a teenager. And they had trained this child up in the ways of the Lord. They'd taken that child to church and to Sunday school and taught him everything that he needed to know about God. But yet when he hit those teenage years, the rebellion set in. He wanted to do things his way. He didn't want to go to church anymore. He wanted to do just drugs. And it put a great deal of strain on the family. The pastor's family was going through a terrific storm. And he did everything he could. He counseled the child, tried to teach the child, discipline the child, and he didn't know him. And finally the pastor said, "I've given it to God." And he said he prayed a prayer where he said, "God, this storm has got the best of me. I'm turning it over to you. I want you to guide this child. Don't let him get hurt too bad in the storm. But when it's over, let this child still have faith." And the pastor said after he prayed that prayer, within him he felt this peace where he'd been torn up for months. Now he felt a little bit of peace that he finally turned the situation over to someone who could control the storm. And I think that's what we're looking for too. Everything in us is a mess. We want someone that can control the evil storms that are within us. The disciples asked Christ, "Don't you care?" How often do we ask God, "Don't you care?" You know what God's answer is, I think? I think He's already answered the question. And to paraphrase the verse from Scripture, God would say, "I loved you so much that I gave my one and only Son, that whosoever believeth in Him will not perish, but have eternal life." He gave us a Son that can give us peace as we go through our storms of life that we're in today. And He gave us a Son that's going to redeem us when we go through the final big storm, when we go through death. That's a great God. And to Him, I think we give praise and honor. And what else can I say? But I mean,